The pen slipped across the paper as Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy from hours of endless work. The office was silent, except for the low hum of the lights above. He'd barely noticed the strange seal glowing faintly at the corner of the contract. He thought it was just a stamp, a mistake, a detail too small to care about. Outside the sky rumbled, though the night was clear. The air in the room turned colder. The signature dried faster than ink should. Daniel felt a sudden shiver race down his spine. He brushed it off and pushed the papers aside, unaware that he had not just signed a contract, but a binding he could never escape. As the clock ticked past midnight, something shifted. The walls seemed closer, the shadows stretched longer, and in that moment, Daniel had no idea that with one careless stroke, he'd had called something into his world, something that, even now, was already on its way to his door. Daniel sat slumped in his chair with papers stacked high on his desk. The glow of the city outside barely reaching through the tall glass windows of the corporate tower. His eyes burned from hours of reading lines of text he did not care about. Every contract looked the same to him, black words on white sheets. Promising money, service, obligation, nothing new. He sighed and rubbed his temples. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and the office around him had gone silent. He was the last one left. He picked up his pen and without focus signed his name on the next page in front of him. The ink spread in a strange way, as though the paper itself was drinking his name. A faint blue shimmer pulsed at the corner of the sheet. Daniel blinked and leaned closer, but it was gone before he could be sure. He brushed it off his tired eyes. Playing tricks, he flipped through the rest of the pile and forced his signature onto them quickly just to be done. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, though there had been no storm forecast. He leaned back in his chair, thinking only of his bed. The air in the office shifted slightly colder, and he rubbed his arms. The clock ticked louder in his ears. He tried to ignore it. When he finally stood to leave, he shoved the signed papers into the tray and shut off his desk lamp. The hallways of the tower felt too long and empty. Every step echoed against the marble floor. His mind was dull, but unease scratched at the edges of his thoughts. He reached the elevator and pressed the button. As the doors closed, he caught sight of his reflection in the steel. His eyes looked hollow, his tie loose, his face pale. For a moment, the reflection seemed to flicker, as if someone stood behind him. But when he turned, there was only empty air. The ride down felt longer than it ever had. Daniel reached his apartment past midnight, the city outside unusually quiet. He dropped his bag and sank onto the couch, exhaustion pulling at him, yet sleep did not come easily. His thoughts drifted back to the contract, the strange shimmer, the sound of thunder. He tried to laugh at himself. Contracts do not glow, ink does not move. Storms do not appear from nowhere. He told himself it was just his tired brain inventing things, but deep inside a knot of unease grew. The night dragged on with every creak of the building making him tense. At 3 a.m, a sharp knock echoed against his door. Daniel froze. No one visited at this hour. He waited. His breath caught. Another knock came. Slower, heavier. He forced himself to the door and opened it quickly, but the hallway was empty. He frowned and looked down. At his feet sat a narrow silver case covered in strange markings that glowed faintly blue in the dim light. Mist curled from the edges as if the box was breathing. His stomach tightened as he bent to lift it. The metal felt colder than ice against his hands. The moment he touched it, the markings flared and the lock clicked open. He stumbled back as the lid rose on its own, and a wave of chilling air spilled across the floor. From inside the mist, a figure stepped out. A girl no older than her early 20s, with silver hair falling like liquid light across her shoulders. Her eyes glowed faint blue, her skin almost translucent. She lowered herself gracefully on one knee and bowed her head. Her voice soft yet firm filled the hall. "Master, I have come as promised by the contract." Daniel's mouth went dry. He could not form words. He stared at the strange girl kneeling in his apartment as though she had been waiting for him all along. The silver case melted into nothing, leaving only her and the faint glow of blue light around her body. She raised her head, her gaze locking onto him with unshakable certainty. "You are my master now, bound by the seal of your own hand." Daniel stumbled back, his voice finally breaking free. He shouted that she had the wrong place, the wrong person, but she shook her head gently and her eyes did not waver. "The contract was signed, the seal was accepted. You cannot deny it. My life is yours," she whispered, the sound echoing through the apartment as if more than one voice spoke. Her words. Daniel's heart pounded. His mind screamed that this was impossible. Yet every detail from the glowing seal to the icy box told him it was real. The girl remained kneeling before him, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light, waiting for his command, and Daniel realized with a cold rush of terror that his careless signature had summoned something beyond his understanding, something that would not leave, something already bound to him. Daniel stood frozen at the door as the silver-haired girl slowly lifted her head, her glowing blue eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. The air around her shimmered faintly as if the room itself bent toward her presence. She rose gracefully to her feet and stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the floor, yet every movement heavy with meaning. Daniel stumbled back until his shoulder hit the wall, his throat dry as he whispered who she was. The girl tilted her head, almost curious at his fear, and spoke again, her voice soft yet echoing like it came from a chamber deeper than his apartment. "I am Lyra, sworn to serve by the bond of the contract you signed. I am yours until released." Daniel shook his head wildly, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as he tried to laugh it off. He told her there was no contract like that. He had only signed work papers. But even as he said it, the memory of the glowing seal returned sharp and cold. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes searching his face, not with threat, but with a strange calm devotion. The atmosphere thickened as if the walls leaned inward. The lights above flickered once, then steadied. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table, but when he reached for it, the screen flashed only blue symbols before going dark. Lyra placed a hand lightly against his arm, her touch icy but not painful. "You should not resist. The bond cannot be broken by denial," she said, her words pressing against his ears like truth carved into stone. Daniel yanked his arm away and demanded who sent her. Lyra lowered her gaze and answered that she was not sent. She was summoned by his signature. Daniel's pulse hammered in his temples, his mouth dry as sand. He insisted he wanted nothing to do with her, that she should leave. But Lyra shook her head slowly. "I cannot leave. As long as the bond is active, my place is beside you." Before Daniel could argue, another knock rattled his door, sharp and deliberate. He froze and looked at Lyra. Her eyes narrowed and she whispered quickly, "Do not open it." The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound against the wood. Daniel's heart raced as he stepped back. Lyra moved to the center of the room and raised her hands. Light rippled across her fingers like liquid silver, forming faint patterns in the air. Shadows pressed under the crack of the door, as if figures waited outside. Daniel whispered in panic, asking what was happening. Lyra's gaze stayed locked on the door, and her voice dropped into something heavier. "The hunters are early." Daniel pressed himself against the wall, fear choking him. The word hunters spun in his mind with no meaning. yet all the weight of danger. The knocking stopped, leaving silence so deep it roared in his ears. Lyra kept her stance ready, the blue glow around her body brightening. Daniel stared in disbelief at this strange girl in his apartment, weaving light with her hands. He whispered again who these hunters were. Lyra finally turned to him, her expression grave. They know of the bond, they will want to take it, and they will kill you to make it theirs. Daniel's breath caught, his chest tightening with each word. He tried to deny it, but deep down he knew something had shifted the moment his pen touched that paper. Suddenly the window behind him rattled violently, a crack slicing across the glass as though invisible claws scraped it. Daniel ducked instinctively. Lyra raised her hand and a pulse of blue energy rippled outward. The window steadied, but shadows flickered against it from outside. She stepped closer to Daniel, placing herself between him and the threat, her presence both alien and protective. Daniel stared at her, torn between fear and the strange trust her voice carried. The silence stretched again, then slowly faded into nothing. Whatever was outside seemed to retreat. Lyra lowered her hands and the glow dimmed. She turned to him, her face pale but calm. "They will return, and next time they will not knock," she whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. Every part of him wanted to run, to throw her out, to pretend none of this was real. But the silver case was gone. The strange symbols had burned into his mind, and Lyra stood before him, unshakable in her claim. The contract was real, and so was the danger it brought. The night stretched ahead, heavy with dread. Daniel realized he was no longer alone, not by choice but by a bond written in ink he should never have touched. And as Lyra stepped closer once more, her voice soft yet certain, "From this night on, Master, your fate is no longer only yours." The weight of those words sank into him like iron, and Daniel understood that his life had just been rewritten forever. Daniel could not sleep that night as Lyra sat silently near the window, her silver hair catching the faint city light, her glowing blue eyes scanning the darkness outside, as though she expected something to emerge at any moment. He paced the apartment, demanding explanations, but every time she opened her mouth, her words only left him more unsettled. She told him the bond he had created with his careless signature was not just legal, it was living. An ancient seal written in code older than his species. He tried to laugh nervously and called it impossible, but his own eyes had seen the ink glow, and his ears had heard the hunters scratching at his door. Lyra finally turned to face him, her expression calm, yet fragile, as though each word cost her strength. "You cannot tear the contract, you cannot burn it, you cannot pretend it never happened. Once signed, the bond becomes part of you." Daniel froze with the weight of her voice pressing on his chest. The next morning he woke to the smell of food. Yet it was unlike anything he had ever seen. Lyra had prepared a meal with tools that had appeared from nowhere, silver utensils that unfolded from shimmering light. She spoke gently, instructing him to eat. The taste was rich and strange, filling him with both warmth and unease. He pushed the plate away and demanded again who she really was. Her eyes darkened as she answered that she came from a race bred as servants to powerful alien houses, their lives dictated by contracts that bound them in body and soul. Daniel's stomach twisted at her words. She explained that the hunters they had heard last night were mercenaries who sought to steal bonded servants and sell them to the highest bidder. He shook his head, trying to make sense of a world he never asked to enter. Lyra leaned forward, lowering her voice until it was almost a whisper. "If they discover the bond you carry, they will not only take me, they will kill you so another can sign in your place." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine as the image of the shadow scratching his window returned. He pressed her for answers, demanding to see the contract again. Lyra's eyes widened in alarm, and she quickly shook, her head warning him that the bond was dangerous to look upon with human eyes. He ignored her and tore through his briefcase until he found the stack of papers. His hands shook as he flipped them. The contract was there, but it was not like before. The letters writhed across the page, twisting and shifting like insects crawling over each other. The ink shimmered blue, then black, then silver. Daniel staggered back, dropping the file on the floor. Lyra darted forward, grabbing his wrist, her hands trembling with an intensity he had not seen before. "Never stare into it. Never try to read it. It is alive. It will consume you," she whispered, her breath sharp and uneven. Daniel ripped his arm free and shouted at her that this was insane. But his voice cracked, betraying his fear. He asked how he could break the bond if not by destroying the contract. Lyra's eyes fell to the ground as she whispered that the only way to end it was through death, either hers or his. Silence crushed the room after her words. Daniel's chest tightened. He refused to believe her. He shouted that she was lying, yet the way her shoulders sagged told him she was not. He pressed his palms to his eyes and tried to breathe. Everything in his life had been simple yesterday, and now one signature had tied him to a world he never knew existed. Lyra moved quietly to him, her voice soft but steady. "I did not choose this, but I will protect you, even if you despise me, because the bond demands it." Daniel opened his eyes and saw her standing before him with a strange sadness in her gaze. He wanted to push her away, yet at the same time he felt the weight of her words sink into him. She was trapped as much as he was, bound by rules neither of them had written. Outside the window, shadows moved across the street, though no one walked. There, Lyra's body stiffened and her glowing eyes sharpened like blades. She whispered that the hunters were watching again. Daniel's pulse pounded as he backed away from the window, his mind spinning. The contract was alive, the girl was bound, and unseen enemies already circled his world. And in that moment he realized the nightmare was not ending, it was only beginning. The air inside the apartment felt heavy, as if unseen hands pressed down on the walls and ceiling. Daniel paced the floor, his chest tight with unease, while Lyra stood near the window, her glowing blue eyes fixed on the empty street below. She told him the hunters would not wait long, and when they came they would not come politely. Daniel tried to argue that this was madness, that hunters and contracts and alien servants belonged in stories, not in his home. But his own voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to himself. Lyra turned to him, her expression calm yet grim, and whispered that denial would not save him, only preparation could. Daniel shook his head, saying he had no weapons, no training, no way to fight whatever shadow stalked them. Lyra's lips curved faintly, though not in a smile. Her hand lifted and light shimmered around her fingers, weaving into sharp lines of silver, energy that crackled like living fire. Daniel staggered back, staring in disbelief as blades of light formed and then dissolved into her palms. Before he could demand more answers, a sudden crash thundered through the room as the living room window shattered inward, shards of glass raining across the floor like knives. Daniel dropped flat to the ground, covering his head, as a dark figure leapt through the broken frame. Tall and broad, with armor that gleamed faintly under the city lights, its face hidden by a black mask glowing red at the eyes, Lyra reacted instantly. A burst of silver energy exploded from her hands, forcing the figure back against the wall. The sound of the impact rattled the pictures from Daniel's shelves, but before he could even rise, another crash shook the apartment door as it bent under the force of something ramming it from the hall. Daniel scrambled behind the couch, his heart slamming in his chest. He peered over the edge as Lyra moved with speed that no human could match. She leapt across the room, slashing with her silver light, striking the armored intruder, who roared in a voice that sounded neither human nor machine. The door gave way, and two more figures stormed inside, their weapons flashing with eerie red light. Daniel screamed and ducked lower as beams of energy cut across the wall, scorching the paint black. Lyra spun mid-air, her body moving like water, yet sharp as steel. She struck the first intruder down with a surge of power, then faced the two at the door. Daniel could only watch as the room became a storm of light and shadow. The hunters moved with ruthless precision, but Lyra matched them blow for blow. Still, Daniel saw her falter with every strike, as if each burst of energy drained her. One of the hunters fired a shot that shattered the kitchen counter, sending shards of wood spraying. Across the room, Daniel coughed, choking on the smoke and dust as fear threatened to overwhelm him. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Stay down, Master, they cannot take you." But her words filled him with dread, not comfort. He clutched the edge of the couch, his nails digging into the fabric, as he watched one hunter grab her by the arm and slam her into the wall. She cried out, her silver glow flickering. Daniel's chest tightened with a surge of helpless rage. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a broken piece of glass, and hurled it at the hunter, though it bounced harmlessly off the armor. The hunter turned its glowing eyes toward him, and for a heartbeat Daniel thought he was dead. But Lyra ripped herself free with a scream that split the air and unleashed a blast of energy that tore the hunter apart in a flash of light. Smoke and silence filled the apartment as the last of the armored figures collapsed to the floor lifeless. Daniel rose shakily to his feet, his legs trembling. Lyra stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her silver glow dimming as though she had burned out too much of her strength. She swayed slightly before collapsing to her knees. Daniel rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground, her body cold and trembling like ice in his arms. He whispered frantically, asking if she was hurt, if she could stand. Her lips barely moved as she whispered back, "They will come again, stronger. They will never stop, because the bond makes you a target." Daniel's heart sank as he held her weak form against him, the broken glass glittering around them and the walls scarred with black burns. He realized with a crushing weight that his life was no longer his own. The hunters were real, the contract was real, and the war he had signed into with one careless stroke had only just begun. Daniel sat on the floor of his ruined apartment, his breath ragged and shallow as he held Lyra in his arms. The smoke from the destroyed wall still curled upward like dark fingers trying to choke the air. Glass shards glittered across the ground, catching the faint glow from her fading energy. His mind spun with disbelief, yet his body trembled with the undeniable truth that the hunters were real, and that Lyra had saved his life with powers he could not begin to understand. She stirred weakly, opening her glowing blue eyes, and whispered that they needed to move before more came. Daniel wanted to argue, but the desperation in her voice silenced him. He helped her to her feet, and together they slipped out of the apartment into the stairwell. Every creak of the metal steps echoed like a warning. Every shadow seemed alive. They reached the basement of the building, where an emergency generator buzzed faintly. Daniel guided her to a bench and demanded the truth. He shouted that she owed him answers, that he could not live another second without knowing why his life had become a battlefield. Lyra lowered her gaze, her silver hair falling across her face as though she carried the weight of centuries. Finally she lifted her eyes and spoke in a voice heavy with sorrow. "The contract you signed was not an ordinary document. It was a fragment of an ancient bond created by alien lords. It was designed to enslave my kind. We were bred to serve through these bindings. Once your hand touched it, you became my master whether you wished it or not. Daniel felt his stomach twist as he heard the words. He wanted to deny them, but the memory of the shifting ink and glowing seals silenced his denial. Lyra went on explaining that her people once lived free until powerful houses discovered how to forge living contracts. Documents that carried their own will and bent reality to their terms. Each servant became tied to the signer, unable to resist, unable to disobey. Daniel clenched his fists and shouted that she deserved freedom, not chains. But Lyra only shook her head with a faint, bitter smile. I have never known freedom. I was born into the bond. It is all I understand. But when I saw that a human had signed the contract, I did not resist. I followed willingly, because your kind is different. Your kind still understands choice. Her words struck him like a blow. Daniel paced the room, anger boiling within him. He demanded to know why the hunters wanted her so badly. Lyra's expression darkened as she explained that bonded servants were the most valuable prize in the galaxy. Some were used as warriors, some as spies, some as living weapons. Whoever controlled the contract controlled the servant. And Daniel, as a human, had no protection from those who would kill him just to claim her. Daniel sank against the wall, his mind spinning with fear. He thought of his ordinary life only days ago and felt it crumble into dust. Lyra moved closer and placed her cold hand on his shoulder, her voice softer now. I cannot force you to. Trust me, but know this. As long as the bond exists, I will protect you with my life, whether you want me or not. Daniel turned his face away, fighting the storm inside him. He hated the idea of being her master, yet a strange pull told him he could not simply abandon her. He whispered that there had to be a way to break the bond without death. Lyra closed her eyes as though the question was a wound, and said only, if there is such a way, it has been lost for centuries. The hopelessness in her tone chilled him more than the hunter's weapons had. A noise above startled them both. Footsteps echoed through the stairwell, heavy and deliberate. Lyra's body tensed, her eyes glowing brighter again. Daniel rose to his feet, his pulse thundering. She pulled him close and whispered that their time was short. The hunters were not the only ones searching. There were others who knew of the human who had bound a servant. Daniel felt the crushing weight of fate press down on him as he stared at her glowing eyes. He realized he was now at the center of something far larger than his own life, a war for control over beings like Lyra, a war that would not end until either he or she was gone. Yet deep inside him a spark lit, a choice forming. He could betray her and try to run, or he could stand with her and face the storm together. And as the footsteps drew closer, Daniel clenched his jaw and knew the next decision he made would define not only his future, but hers as well. Daniel followed Lyra through the dim alleys of the city, his mind still reeling from the truth she had revealed. Every shadow felt alive and every sound made his pulse quicken. They moved cautiously until they reached a small office building on the edge of downtown. Daniel said he knew someone here who could help, a liar he trusted with sensitive matters. Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing with unease, but Daniel insisted they needed human knowledge to understand the contract. They climbed the stairs into a cramped office where the lawyer, Mr. Carter, greeted Daniel with surprise. His eyes widened at Lyra, but he quickly masked it with a professional smile. Daniel poured out the story, stumbling over his words as he described glowing ink, shifting contracts, and masked hunters breaking into his apartment. Mr. Carter listened silently, nodding his head and scribbling notes. Lyra stood behind Daniel, her gaze never leaving the man, as if she could sense something beneath his calm demeanor. Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair after hearing everything, and said quietly that if Daniel had such a document, it must be kept safe. that it could be worth more than anything in the world. Daniel frowned uneasily at the way he emphasized worth. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly on his shoulder. Daniel explained he no longer had the contract in front of him, but that it reacted to his touch like it was alive. Carter's lips curved faintly as if he already knew. He said he could protect Daniel and find a way to dissolve the bond. Daniel felt hope flicker in his chest, but Lyra's voice cut cold into the moment. "He lies," she whispered. Daniel turned in shock, but her glowing eyes blazed as she stared at Carter. He already called them before Daniel could respond. The office door burst open, and two hunters stepped inside, their armor gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Carter rose from his chair without fear and greeted them like old allies. Daniel's stomach dropped as realization hit. His trusted friend had betrayed him. The hunters' weapons hummed with red light as they advanced. Lyra shoved Daniel behind her, her silver glow igniting as she raised her hands. Beams of red energy cut across the room, scorching the walls. Daniel ducked low, crawling across the floor as chaos erupted. Lyra clashed with the hunters, her body moving faster than Daniel could track, but every strike drained her further. Carter shouted above the noise, ordering the hunters not to kill Daniel. He must live. The bond must be transferred. He yelled. Daniel's blood ran cold. Transferred. The word sliced through him with terror. They didn't just want Lyra, they wanted the bond itself. One hunter seized Lyra by the throat, slamming her against the wall. She gasped, her glow faltering. Daniel's body moved on instinct as he grabbed a heavy lamp from the desk and smashed it against the hunter's head. The blow barely staggered the creature, but it bought Lyra a moment to twist free and unleash a blast of silver energy that sent it crashing across the room. Daniel turned on Carter, his voice trembling with fury, demanding to know why. Carter sneered and said Daniel was a fool, that he had stumbled into power beyond imagination and wasted it, that others like him would pay any price for control of such a servant. Daniel's chest burned with rage, but before he could strike, Carter fled out the back door, leaving Daniel and Lyra facing the hunters alone. Lyra collapsed to one knee, her glow flickering weakly. Daniel knelt beside her, his voice shaking, as he promised he would not let them take her. The hunters advanced again, relentless and merciless. Daniel's heart pounded as he searched desperately for anything to fight with. Then his eyes fell on the scattered papers on Carter's desk, among them the contract itself glowing faintly. Even from across the room, he crawled toward it under a hail of red beams, his hands shaking as he grabbed the paper. The ink writhed alive, shifting with every heartbeat. He felt it burning into his skin, but he held on. Lyra cried out for him to stop, her voice filled with terror. But Daniel's eyes blazed with sudden clarity. He realized the hunters feared the contract because it obeyed only him, the true signer. He rose slowly, the paper glowing brighter in his hands. The hunters froze, uncertain. Daniel's voice thundered with a strength he had never known as he shouted that they would not touch her again. The contract pulsed with light, flooding the room with silver fire. The hunters staggered back, hissing in pain. Daniel's heart raced as he realized he held the one weapon none of them could challenge. Yet even as the light burned the enemy back, he felt the terrifying weight of what the bond was doing to him. And deep inside he knew that the next step he took would decide whether he became her protector or her jailer forever. The office still glowed with the searing light of the living contract as Daniel stood with the paper burning hot in his hands, his breath ragged and his heart pounding like a war drum. The hunters staggered back, their black armor smoking under the silver fire that poured from the writhing ink. Lyra lay on the floor, gasping weakly, her silver glow barely flickering. Daniel looked at her, then at the enemy closing in again, their red eyes blazing with hatred. He felt the weight of every choice pressing down on him. He never asked for this bond yet. It had dragged him into a battle for survival, and now the only thing standing between him and death was the very contract that chained Lyra to him. One hunter lunged forward its weapon, slicing the air with a deadly hum. Instinctively, Daniel shouted for it to stop. The contract pulsed violently, and the hunter froze mid-step as though an invisible hand gripped its body. Daniel gasped, staring at the power surging through him. The other hunter fired a blast, but the silver fire curved and devoured it mid-air. Daniel realized the contract did not just bind Lyra, it obeyed him as the signer. It bent reality to his command. For a moment, the temptation whispered in his mind. With this power, he could end the hunters. He could make them kneel. He could control Lyra completely. The thought sickened him, yet it also burned with a strange allure. He glanced at Lyra and saw her trembling eyes watching him, not with fear of the hunters, but fear of what he might choose. She whispered hoarsely, "Master, do not let it consume you." Her words cut through the storm in his mind. Daniel clenched his teeth, fighting against the pull of the contract. He raised the paper high and shouted for the hunters to leave. The ink flared, blinding them with a burst of silver light that hurled them back through the broken door and into the night. Silence fell heavy and suffocating as the glow finally dimmed. Daniel's arm shook violently as he dropped the contract onto the desk. The paper writhed like a living snake before going still. He collapsed to his knees beside Lyra, cradling her cold body in his arms. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and sorrow, whispering that he had done what no master ever had. He had chosen to protect instead of command. Daniel's throat tightened as he told her she was not his servant, not his possession, that he could not live knowing she was bound by chains written in ink. Lyra shook her head faintly and told him the bond could not be broken, that she had been born into it and would die with it. Daniel's eyes burned with defiance as he looked at the trembling contract on the desk. He whispered that maybe no one had tried to break it the way he would. He reached out his hand, the paper rising again as if resisting him. The ink squirmed and screamed in his mind, filling him with visions of endless chains binding thousands of beings like Lyra. His body shook, but he forced the words from his lips. "I release you. I tear these chains." The paper shrieked in silence, splitting down the center as if alive. The glow flared once more before shattering into 1,000 shards of light that dissolved into nothing. Lyra gasped, her body convulsing as if struck by lightning, then stilled. Daniel panicked, holding her tighter, begging her not to leave. Slowly her eyes opened, and for the first time the blue glow was gone. Only deep human-like brown stared back at him. She whispered in disbelief that the bond was gone, that she was free. Her tears shimmered as they rolled down her pale cheeks. Daniel felt his own tears fall as he told her he wanted no servant, no chains, only an ally and a friend. Lyra buried her face against his chest, her body trembling with the unfamiliar weight of freedom. Outside, the night wind howled, but Daniel felt something shift. The hunters would not stop searching. He knew this fight was far from over. Yet now they would not face it as master and servant, but as equals. As dawn broke and light spilled through the broken windows, Daniel helped Lyra to her feet. The city outside looked unchanged, but for him, everything had transformed. The man who signed the wrong papers now carried the burden of a universe that knew his name. Lyra looked at him with quiet determination, promising that even free she would not leave his side. Daniel nodded, his jaw set with resolve. Together they stepped out into the morning, not as master and servant, but as allies bound not by ink but by choice. And though shadows still moved in distant corners, Daniel no longer felt helpless. He had faced the bond and shattered it, and in Doing so, he had discovered that the real power was not in command, but in the courage to choose freedom for another. If you love thrilling HFY Sci-Fi stories like this, turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next twist in our sci-fi universe. Make sure to hit that subscribe button